Let's talk about Labour's war on civil liberties. In just the past week, Labour has refreshed or restarted its campaign for digital ID. There's going to be a big public consultation. We're going to get it whether we like it or not. We're just going to be asked how best to implement it. Parliament has voted in favour of scrapping jury trials in certain criminal cases. And also, the Labour government has unveiled its definition of anti-Muslim hostility, aka Islamophobia. We'll come on to the Islamophobia stuff a bit later on, because I think there's a bit of a broader discussion there to have. But Paul, does it alarm you that this government doesn't seem to have achieved much by way of implementing its manifesto commitments, or it doesn't seem to be a traditionally socially democratic government or anything that you might expect from Labour parties or Labour governments of old, but it is steamrolling ahead with quite an authoritarian agenda against our civil liberties? That seems to be the one thing that it does manage to get through.
Yeah, and coming out with these type of policies when there was no serious public debate about them previously. They weren't in the party's manifesto, and they've just decided to launch them anyway. And it seems to me that when it comes to, let's be blunt, when it comes to digital ID, the chief reason that they want to implement that is because of the massive state failures over mass immigration going back many years. Successive governments have been completely unable, or some might say unwilling, to control our borders. We have so many people in the country now who frankly shouldn't be here. I suspect that the state doesn't know just how many people are in the country who shouldn't be here. So they argue that this is one of the ways to address that problem. So effectively what they're saying is that we all have to pay the price through a tax on our liberties, our ancient liberties, because of that state failure. And it's very questionable whether it would work anyway. I mean, if you look at France, for example, France has got ID cards, but it's still got hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants in the country. And for me, I mean, sometimes it's tempting. Sometimes it's tempting to say, okay, if this is what you think is going to allow us to protect our borders, then let's go for it. But actually, for me, the state is there to serve free and law-abiding citizens and to be answerable to us, not the other way around. And I think that tips this in terms of digital ID. I think tips the balance in that regard. And I think when it comes to jury trials as well, I mean, very, very similar situation. That actually, again, this is an ancient right, and I think, in truth, is one of the most appalling attacks on our liberties. And particularly, and you touched on it, Fraser, particularly at a time when there is this kind of increasing authoritarianism in the country, and people are being prosecuted or investigated for writing or saying or doing things that really ought not to be regarded as crimes, and put in prison for things they've written on social media, is all the more reason to actually defend trial by jury. And the argument that because there's a backlog, I think is absolutely morally bankrupt, because if something is right as a foundational principle of your justice system, which is that you should be tried by a jury, 12 men or women, 12 of your peers, then actually that's a matter of principle that can't be, I don't think, undermined simply because you've got an administrative problem of a backlog of cases. So it's an appalling attack on liberty, and there's no way I could even try to defend it.
Yeah, and you could just so easily see how that argument could just be levelled against any of our liberties and rights. I mean, it's horribly inefficient to hold elections to consult the public on anything, if you think about it that crudely. But of course, we absolutely hold dearly to that right. And on the question of illegal migration, I think it's kind of risible that the government is suggesting that, well, someone may be employing someone who's here illegally at the moment, but as soon as they discover they don't have this digital ID, the correct app on their phone, they're going to be up in arms. They're going to say, and they're going to sack them, and they're going to report them to the authorities. It just doesn't add up at all. So I think, Brendan, as well as everything else, they are kind of taking us for mugs with some of these policies.
Absolutely. As Paul says, it's like the worst of both worlds. So firstly, they basically let our borders fall apart and fail to police them, fail to exercise sovereign control over the territory and let people in willy-nilly. And then they punish us for that. They make us live with the consequences of it by, instead of policing our borders, policing us and encouraging us all to get digital ID to prove that we have the right to be in the country, et cetera, or the right to work, rather. So, yeah, it's an awful system, and it's an attempt to patch up their own failures. And I'm not surprised at all there has been so much public discontent over the digital ID idea. And then the jury trials, I mean, that is incredibly disturbing, because this is an ancient right. This is a right that we've had for a very long time. It's really the most democratic aspect of justice, where ordinary people get to sit in judgment on one of their fellow citizens and to decide his or her fate. I mean, it's an entirely democratic idea. The notion is that ordinary people are more trustworthy in these cases than one judge. One often posh judge who will come from a particular part of society, whose judgment might be skewed by prejudice or experience or whatever else. To counter that, we invite ordinary men and women into the justice system to use their moral muscles, their freedom of thought, their ability of, figuring things out in order to pass judgment. And to lose that is catastrophic. And it really does speak to, I think, the culture that's underlying all of these authoritarian trends, which is just this staggering culture of distrust between the government and ordinary people. They just don't trust us. They don't trust us to think for ourselves or to speak for ourselves. As Paul says, there have been numerous arrests and investigations for speech, for things people have said online. They don't trust us to weigh things up in a court of law, and they're scrapping that under the guise of speeding up the justice system. They don't trust us to go about our business, to get a job in the correct way, so they want to give us these ID cards. It's just this really poisonous culture that exists between a government that is incredibly aloof and ordinary people who it looks down upon as these, untrustworthy, difficult people who need to be continually policed and continually kept in check. I think all of these trends speak to that broader culture, and it is just the enemy of freedom when you have a government that thinks in that way.
And one thing that's particularly striking is that this is a government led by a human rights lawyer. And, you'd think normally that would mean that he'd be interested in protecting civil liberties, especially, that pertain to the justice system. But in fact, you see this strange kind of cognitive dissonance where, you both rightly say it's an ancient right. I mean, it goes right back to Magna Carta. Some historians actually say it goes even beyond that to, the Anglo-Saxons and how they dispensed with justice. And yet, so there's this cavalier attitude to jury trials and things like that. But whereas the Human Rights Act or the European Convention on Human Rights, which, by comparison are basically from yesterday, are treated with this extraordinary reverence and are something that, we wouldn't dare tweak or tinker with. Paul, I don't know if you have any final thoughts on this.
Well, only to say really that, the old maxim that scratch a liberal and an authoritarian bleeds, I think, probably explains why the likes of Starmer and others who would present themselves as very liberal on these questions, actually underneath it are quite authoritarian. It's certainly been my experience anyway.